circumstances are, but we as the people make up the church, that wherever we are, we can gather as a group of believers and we can open your word and we can study it, Lord. And I pray most importantly that what we study we would take and apply to our lives, Lord, that your word would not just be empty words to us, but Lord, that we would take our lives and we would use the Bible as a mirror and we would reflect upon your word and we would see, is it how we're living? Is there something in our lives that we need to change? So Lord, as we continue searching for answers to some of life's questions, as we continue to see how it is that we can be in this world and yet not conform to its standards, Lord, I pray that we'd be reminded that your word is true and will remain true forever, and that when we have questions, we can go to your word for the answers. So Father, be with us this morning, and I pray that your message would speak to us. And we pray these things in your Son's name. Amen. We're going to hope that this lasts. I forgot to charge my iPad, and I walked in, and it was at 5%. So if I go off script, it's because something died. No, I won't do that, I promise. I do have paper as backup. Always have redundancy, right? We opened a series last week entitled In the World, and we said that it was coming from where we previously were, right? We'd been talking in our last series about being in the world but not being of the world. And we said, what does it mean to be in the world but not of the world? How do we balance this idea of living in a society that doesn't have the same morals or standards that maybe we do as believers, and yet still live the lives that we're supposed to? How is it that we can connect with the world around us and we can still be that light to the world around us without compromising our faith? That's the big question, right? Because we know we're supposed to be in the world, that as Christians and as believers, we can't just accept Christ and then go live in a cave, right? We could, but that's not what God's called us to do. We said that God has called us to be the light in the dark world around us, right? Because darkness, there's this great thing about light we talked about maybe 6 months ago. Darkness can never put out light, right? It doesn't matter how dark it is. You can have the dimmest light, and as soon as you light that light, it continues to shine, right? Darkness can't swallow up light. So it doesn't matter how bright we are shining or how dark the world is around us, we can still be that light in the dark world. But we have to be in it in order to do that, right? And that's what we've been talking about. So we're going to continue this morning looking at our series. We're in Daniel chapter 3 this morning. Last week we were in chapter 1. So if you want to open your Bibles to Daniel chapter 3, we'll get there in a moment. And we're going to continue looking at Daniel and company, right? We said it was Daniel and company because he's got 3 other individuals with him, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? So there's 4 of them that have been taken into captivity. And we're looking at Daniel and company and seeing how they were able to be in a godless nation, right? We said they were strangers in a godless nation last week, and yet they were still able to stand and succeed without compromising their faith. So before we jump straight into Daniel chapter 3, I want to kind of summarize what we're skipping over in chapter 2, right? Last week we read about the captivity of Daniel coming from Jerusalem. Babylon laid siege to Jerusalem, and Daniel and the other 3 and others from Judah were taken into captivity during this whole process, and they were put into a training regimen, right? They were told that they were going to be trained for the next 3 years, and at the end of the 3-year period, they would stand before the king, and they would be tested to see if they were fit to serve the king. These men were supposed to be the best and the brightest amongst everyone in the lands, and they were going to be tested to see, can you serve in a royal position? Are you worthy of it? Are you smart enough to handle the business that the king needs you to handle? Can you run a province? Can you handle the affairs of a kingdom? This is what they're going through. And in chapter 1, we see that Daniel and company immediately refuse what? The food that was offered, right? They were given a strict diet that they were supposed to be put on that was going to be from the king's food. And Daniel and his friends said, look, no offense to you, king, and no offense to you who's in charge of giving this to us, but we don't want this. This doesn't fit with what we believe that we should be eating. And respectfully, we'd like to decline it, but offer a counter. Instead, can you give us this diet? And they offered a diet, and the man said, look, I'm worried that the king is going to come after me. And Daniel says, look, try it for 10 days, and if at the end of 10 days we look worse than anyone else who's in this program, then we'll switch and eat food. But after 10 days, what happens? After 10 days, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego look better than anybody else in this program, right? And so they agreed that for the remainder of the time that they're in this program, they'd be able to eat what they requested. So last week we saw Daniel take that stand. It was something small. I mean, it was over food. You know, sometimes when it comes to food, some of us are pickier than others, right? I've been called a garbage disposal before. My wife is not necessarily picky, which is really good. But I know some people who are very picky eaters. They won't eat certain things. Maybe you have kids or family or friends who, when you guys go out places, like there's only one thing they'll ever order from a menu, right? It happens. But Daniel did it for a specific reason, not because he didn't like something, but because it fit with his religious belief. So in chapter 1, they refused this, and after the 10-day period, they look better. So after the 3 years, they're actually brought before the king, right? So Daniel chapter 1, verses 18 to 20, we see that they come to the king. So if you look at the screen, you'll see Daniel chapter 1, verse 20. And this is what happens. After 3 years, because Daniel and his friends took a stance for God, because they said, we're not going to do what we think is wrong. We're going to eat what we think we're supposed to eat. This is how it happens. It says, in the matters of all wisdom and understanding, which the king inquired of them, they're now standing before the king being tested. It says he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were in all of his realm. Daniel and his friends took a stance, and they said, we're going to do what we believe God calls us to do, that what we think is right. And because of it, God rewards them, right? And they are found to be 10 times smarter than anyone else in the land. So after 3 years of training, after 3 years of doing what they believe they were called to do, they're found to be the cream of the crop, right? You're 1, 2, 3, 4 guys, right? When it comes to high school, what do you guys have? You guys have valedictorian and salutatorian, right? Those top 2 spots that everyone competes for, because you get scholarships and you get acknowledgments, right? Well, Daniel and his friends kind of were the top 4 of 5. We don't know who the remaining are, but it's because they took a stance, and God rewarded them for their stance. As you continue into chapter 2, King Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, and we're not going to get too much into the dream today. We will circle back to it at a later time. But in this dream, there's a statue that's erected of different materials, and he doesn't understand the dream. So he calls all of his astrologers and all of his wise men and all of the people that he thinks should be able to interpret this dream. And none of them can, right? None of them can interpret this dream. He didn't call Daniel yet, even though Daniel and his friends were found to be, what, 10 times better, right? He doesn't call Daniel and his friends right away. He calls everybody else. And after they can't interpret the dream, King Nebuchadnezzar says, look, none of you can interpret my dream. You're all dumb, so wipe them all out. Kill them all. All the wise men in all of Babylon, have them brought and have them killed, because they can't interpret my dream. So when they come to Daniel and they come to take him in, Daniel politely asks the captain of the guards, he says, look, no offense, but why is the king trying to kill us all? And they said, well, he had a dream, and no one can interpret it, so he's just wiping everybody out and starting over. And Daniel says, if you'll give me some time, let me go before the king, let me talk to him, we'll see what we can do. So Daniel goes before King Nebuchadnezzar, and he says to the king, look, give me a night that I may ask my God for an interpretation, and let us have some time. And so Daniel goes back, and he talks to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and he tells them the situation. And together they pray. And that night, Daniel goes to sleep, and God reveals to him in a dream what the interpretation of the dream is, right? So Daniel goes before King Nebuchadnezzar, and he gives him a whole breakdown in chapter 2 about what the dream means and how it applies to the nations and to his kingdom. And in verses 48 to 49 of Daniel chapter 2, it says this. It says, then the king advanced Daniel and gave him many great gifts and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and chief of the governors over all of the wise men of Babylon. This is because Daniel was the only one who was able to interpret the dream. It says, then Daniel requested of the king that he set Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. But Daniel sat at the court of the king. So by the end of chapter 2, what we have is not only have Daniel and his 3 friends taken a stance for what they believe to be right. Daniel is able to interpret a dream, and because of it, he gets, put into one of the highest positions that there can be, right? It says that he's put in charge of all of the wise men. He's put in charge of the province of Babylon. He's put in a position that there's not many people that are going to be between him and the king as far as levels of authority. God has rewarded them for what they've done. And Daniel says to the king, look, also with me are these 3 men. Can you put them in charge of the affairs of Babylon? So when we come to chapter 3, what we have is we have Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in some of the highest positions of power that there are in the province of Babylon. And that's extremely important for what we're going to talk about through Daniel chapter 3. So if you're in Daniel chapter 3, we're going to start reading, and we're going to read verses 1 through 7. And then we're going to continue on, and we're going to kind of break this passage down as we go. All right? So Daniel chapter 3, starting in verse 1. It says, Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold, whose height was 60 cubits, and its width was 6 cubits. For us today, that's about 90 feet tall and about 9 feet wide. All right? I'm 6'4", and I'm maybe 3 feet wide. Well, maybe like 2.5 feet. But it's 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide. All right? Have that image in your mind. He set it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Verse 2, Then King Nebuchadnezzar, the king, sent together the officials, the governors, and the captains, the judges, the treasurers, the counselors, the sheriffs, and all the rulers of the province to come to the dedication of the image which Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. He sets up this giant statue and calls everyone of any importance to come to this dedication ceremony, right? It's the ribbon-cutting ceremony. Then the officials, the governors, and the captains, the judges, the treasurers, the counselors, the sheriffs, and all the rulers of the province were gathered together to the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Verse 4. Then a herald cried aloud, To you it is commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that at the time you hear the sound of the cornet, the flute, the harp, the sackbut, the psaltery, the dulcimer, and all kinds of music, you should fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king has set up. Verse 6. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall the same hour be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. Therefore at that time, when all of the people heard the sound of the cornet, the flute, the harp, the sackbut, the psaltery, and all kinds of music, all the peoples, the nations, and the languages fell down and worshipped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Except for 3, which we'll get to in a moment, all right? The first point and the first takeaway that we want to talk about this morning is don't follow the crowd. Now, as we work through the 3 points that we have, at the end of the sermon, they're basically going to create a whole statement, right? And it's going to be something that we can apply to our lives, and that will be extremely important. But the first thing is don't follow the crowd, right? Remember Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and Daniel. They're brought from Judah, right? They're captives in Babylon. But they're not the only ones that were taken captivity from Judah. They're not the only ones from the nation of Israel that had been taken into Babylon. There were others that were taken with them, right? So if you look at verse 7 again, you're going to see this. It says, Therefore, at the time when all the people heard the sound, next slide, jump backwards. We went too far. Jump back to don't follow the crowd, and the next slide is verse 7. In verse 7, what we're going to see is it says that all of the people bow down before the image, right? It says all of the people of all of the languages of all of the nations. They all decide that they're going to bow down. This means that everyone else that was taken into captivity from Judah, along with Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So it means that people that believed the same thing as these 4 men, that came from the same land, that came from the same upbringing, decided to go along with what the king said. When he said, when this music plays, you're to bow down. And they went along and they did it, right? The first thing we want to talk about is not following the crowd. Just because everyone else is doing it, does it make it right? How many of you growing up had a parent say to you, if everyone else jumped off a bridge, would you? Right? We've heard a phrase like that before. My parents tried that on me, and I said, yes, I would, and in fact, I did. That's a different story. I was in Belize, and we were all bridge jumping, and I was the second guy off the bridge. So sometimes it doesn't work. But if everyone else is doing something, it doesn't necessarily make it right, and it doesn't necessarily make it smart. Maybe it wasn't our smartest decision to go bridge jumping, but it was a lot of fun. But Daniel and company decide we're not going to follow the crowd. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego specifically are the ones who are mentioned through Daniel chapter 3 as we'll continue through the story. They decide that they're not going to follow the crowd. And here's the important thing that we need to remember. When you follow the crowd, you're not following God, are you? If the masses are going through a particular direction and those masses are adhering to a different set of morals and a different set of standards than what ours are as believers, then following them is not following God. By doing things just because the masses are doing it doesn't make it right. When I was in basic training, we got to basic when I was at Fort Knox, and the drill sergeant's job out there is to yell and scream and break you down to rebuild you as soldiers, right? You have 9 weeks where all they do is scream in your face, call you all kinds of names, and decide that this is how they're going to treat you. And at first, it's a crazy shock. You're like, oh my goodness, what did I get myself into? But after a while, you get used to it. But one of the things that they did, or they had us do, was there were some individuals who were late for formation, so we were all outside doing push-ups, and they wanted us to yell a phrase. And when we went down, we had to yell a particular phrase. It said, "Thank you, battle buddy." And then on the way up, we had to say a phrase that included a curse word, right? And we had to use this phrase and scream it at the top of our lungs, or else we were going to continue to get yelled at. I had a decision that I had to make. As a believer, do I go along with the crowd because it would be easier? I would blend in, right? You don't want to stick out because you don't want that attention. Or do I take a stance for what I believe, knowing that that could potentially bring more attention to me that you really don't want? And in that moment, I had to decide, what am I going to do? Am I going to live what I claim, or am I going to try to save myself some extra work? I chose to live what I claimed. I chose not to use that phrase. And it drew a little extra attention, and I got pulled out of formation and asked why. And when I told them that that's not the type of language I use and that's not what I believe, I had an individual follow me around for the next 9 weeks who made it his personal mission to just yell and scream and curse at me to try to see if he could get me to break. And even up until about 2 weeks ago, I had an individual in my unit who promised me that he was going to get me to curse by the time he left the unit. He was working on a medical discharge, and he made it his personal mission to try to get me to use language that I told him I will never use. I don't know why he made that his mission. He wasn't the sharpest tool in the shed, but I told him, you will never hear me say those types of things, because I don't believe that that's how God has called me to speak. And it's a small decision that I chose to make. But if you start bending in certain places, if you do it once, now you've completely tarnished what you believe, right? There are other individuals who claim to be Christians who use that same language, and they say, well, so-and-so says it. That's his choice. My choice is not to. But by following the crowds, we can actually do more damage to the name of Christ than by standing alone, right? First thing is, don't follow the crowds, especially if you're using the excuse of, I don't want to stand out, or I don't want to get in trouble, right? I don't want to draw attention to myself. It'll be easier if I just go along with it, and God will understand, right? Have you ever justified that before? You've gone along in a particular situation, and you're like, God gets it. He knows. He knows, but what would he rather you do? It's just safer if I do it. Don't follow the crowd. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego decide we're not going to follow the crowd, right? So let's continue reading. We're going to start back in verse 8. Verse 8, it said, therefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans came near and accused the Jews. They spoke and said to King Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the cornet, the flute, the harp, the sackbut, the psaltery, hold on, stop right there. The sackbut and the psaltery, all right? The sackbut is like a trombone. So don't think it's some weird thing. It looks kind of like a mix between a trumpet and a trombone. And a psaltery is just kind of a stringed instrument. We don't use those a lot anymore as the terms, but those are what they are. The dulcimer and all kinds of music should fall down and worship the golden image. Verse 11. And whoever does not fall down and worship should be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have not regarded you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image which you have set up. Remember how we said in chapter 2 it was going to be extremely important where these 3 men were in power? These 3 men are in extremely high places of power, and they're refusing to bow before the image. What kind of reputation does that give the king? It says to the other people that the king can't even control his own people that he puts in power. Verse 13. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in his rage and fury, commanded Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought. Then they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar spoke and said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image which I have set up?" Verse 15. In verse 15, Nebuchadnezzar kind of gives them a way out. Watch what he says. "Now, if you're ready, at the time you hear the sound of the cornet, the flute, the harp, the sackbut, the psaltery, the dulcimer, and all kinds of music, to fall down and worship the image which I have made, very well." As he's scolding them, he gives them a way out. He says, look, if you've changed your mind, if you're ready to do this next time, I'll let the past go. But the next time you hear it, if you're ready, then very well. We'll just forget this whole thing happened. But if you do not worship, you shall be cast the same hour into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And who is that God who can deliver you out of my hands? Verse 16. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to give you an answer in this matter. If it be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king." Verse 18. "But even if he does not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods, nor worship the golden image which you have set up." We said that the three men decided that they weren't going to follow the crowd, right? And it's gotten them in a bit of a pickle. They know what the punishment is going to be if they don't bow down to the golden image. And yet they've said, we are not going to compromise our faith. We're not going to stray from what we believe just because one man has threatened to put us to death if we don't bow down to this golden image. We're told by our God not to worship false gods or to worship idols, that we are to only worship the one true God. But they're in positions of power. So not only is this a problem because they're not doing what the king said, but they're not doing what the king said, and they're in charge of the affairs of Babylon. The king has put them in positions of power, and now they're making the king look bad because now people are going to start asking questions. You said all of us had to bow down or we'd be put in a fiery furnace. But these three are not bowing down, and you haven't done anything about it. And so the king in verse 15, he brings them in and he says, look, if you're ready to bow down when you hear the music, very well. Again, we'll forget the whole thing ever happened. It was a misunderstanding. I'll explain it to the Chaldeans who ratted on you, and we'll just move on. But if you're not, then I have to punish you. I have to put you in the fiery furnace because that was the decree. Right? Look at what they say. The next point I want you to take away is, even if he doesn't save you, and again, we'll complete that thought with our third and final point, but even if he doesn't save you, this is what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego say. They're saying, even if he doesn't save us, right? Look at verses 17 and 18 again. So it says, if it be so, this is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answering the king, if it be so, if you're going to throw us in the fiery furnace, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. Verse 18 is the best statement that anyone could ever give, and it's really one of the points that we need to take personally into our lives and drive home in every situation, right? It says, but even if he does not, even if he doesn't save us from the fiery furnace, even if we're going to be thrown into the fiery furnace this very hour for not bowing down to you, and we're gone in a pile of ashes, even if he doesn't save us, we will not serve your gods. We will not compromise our faith. We're not going to go against what it is that we believe and what we hold to be true. Even your threats of death will not stop us from doing what we believe to be right. Right? So that phrase, right, it says, even if it costs us our lives. How many of us this morning want to reflect our lives against this as a mirror? How many of us in here this morning can say that we've taken a stance in situations where we thought, even if it costs us our life, we're going to do what we believe God's called us to do? Living in a Western society, living in America, the freedoms that we have of religion, we don't fear persecution like other countries do we? There's been small attacks against churches, against Christians, but not on mass scale. In Nigeria, so far this year, there's been 6,000 Christians that have been killed. That's as of an article that was posted June 30th. There's a genocide going over in Nigeria right now, or going on over there, where not only ISIS, but other individuals are seeking out Christians. In one weekend alone, 238 Christians were killed for what they believed. There are people around the globe that fear for their lives by proclaiming the name of Christ. We don't have that same fear here in America, do we? We don't necessarily worry about being thrown in jail for proclaiming the name of Christ. We don't worry about being beheaded for the name of Christ. Yet Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are taking a stance back here in the Old Testament. And again, you see it throughout Scripture, throughout the New Testament. You'll see martyrs in the New Testament, even the disciples, taking a stance for the name of Christ. They refused to compromise their faith, and for some of them, it didn't end well. Even if it costs us our lives, we're not going to do what you've said for us to do. We're not going to worship your false gods. We're not going to fall down before this image. It's hard to truly comprehend sometimes the seriousness of this statement because of where we live. Sometimes it's easy just for us to let things go and not really think too much about it. That's a hard mirror to check ourselves against. But let's put it in a context that maybe we can understand, right? Even if it costs us our job, even if it costs us a friend, even if it costs us a family member, are you willing to compromise your faith for that item, whatever that may be? That's a little more real for us here, right? Especially because we need a job to be able to put food on the table. If you have families, you know how important a job is. If you're single, you still know how important a job is because you still have your bills to pay, your car, your house, your apartment, whatever it may be. So in your job, are you willing to say, even if it costs me my job, I'm going to stand for what I believe? That's a hard mirror to look against. I want to finish out the chapter, verses 19 to 30, and we're going to see how it plays out for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? Verse 19, it says, Then Nebuchadnezzar was full of fury, and the form of his visage was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Therefore he spoke and commanded that they should heat the furnace 7 times more than it was usually heated. He commanded the most mighty men in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound. This is kind of funny to me, verse 21, if you read what they're bound with, right? Then these men were bound in their trousers, their coats, their hats, and their other garments, and were cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. They wanted to make sure that these individuals burned up, right? So they put as many flammable objects on them as they could. They made sure they had their trousers, their coat, their hat, maybe some mitten gloves, right? They were covering them with everything, and they said, we are going to cover you with all of your stuff and throw you into this furnace that is 7 times hotter than it's ever been before to punish you for what you've done. Verse 22. Therefore, because of the king's commandment was urgent and the furnace exceedingly hot, the flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down, bound in the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king was astonished, and rose up in haste, and spoke and said to his counselors, Did we not cast 3 men bound into the midst of the fire? They answered and said to the king, True, O king. He answered and said, But I see 4 men loose and walking in the midst of the fire, and they are unharmed, and the form of the 4th is like the Son of God. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the mouth of the burning fiery furnace and spoke and said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, your servants of the Most High God, come out and come here. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the midst of the fire. The officials, the governors and captains, and the king's counselors, being gathered together, saw these men upon whose bodies the fire had no power, nor was a hair on their heads singed, neither were their coats changed, nor had the smell of fire even come upon them. I stood next to a grill for all of 45 seconds the other day, and I walked back inside, and I could smell the smoke on my skin. These guys just spent a certain time period in a giant burning furnace, and they didn't even smell like a flame was anywhere near them. That is the awesome power of God. Verse 28, Then Nebuchadnezzar said spoke and said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel, then delivered his servants who trusted in him. They have defied the king's word and yielded their bodies that they may not serve nor worship any god except their own God." 29. Therefore, I make a decree that every people, nation, and language which speaks anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut in pieces, and their houses shall be made a dunghill, because there is no other God who can deliver in this way. Verse 30. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. For Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, this has a happy ending, doesn't it? They took a stance and they stood before the king and they said, "Look, king, may it never be that we would bow down to a false god. But even if it costs us our lives for defying you, so be it. We will serve our God. We will do what we believe to be right." And because of it, they are thrown into the burning fiery furnace, but God protects them. And they come out. And they're rewarded for having taken their stance. And the end result is they are put in an even higher position than they previously were, right? Because what? Because God had a plan for their lives, right? The same way he had a plan for them and for what they were going through, he also has a plan for you. He has a plan for your life. The question is, are you willing to take that stance to see what that road is before you? Are you willing to see what his plan is? The furnace was so hot that they heated up to throw Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in. The men that brought them up to the top to throw them into the furnace were killed instantly by the flames. This furnace was so intense that just being near it killed individuals, and yet the power of God covered Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and protected them because of what they believed was right and for doing what they believed was right. Now, I want to be real, all right? As we look at the end of this passage, as we look through chapter 3, we've seen some pretty bold statements by these three men, and we've seen a pretty amazing result. But this is the point of that TV commercial, right? You ever seen those commercials for fitness products on TV? Call now in the next 30 minutes with just 3 easy payments of $29.99, and your body can look like this. And they put this perfectly sculpted man or woman on the TV, and you're like, oh yeah, I need this product. And then at the very bottom, what does it usually have in small print with a little asterisk next to it? It says, individual results may vary, right? Individual results may vary. Basically, we're not guaranteeing that you're going to look like this guy who probably looked like this before we handed him this product, and we're just using him to sell it. It's the same thing with these three men. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had an amazing result at the end for the stance that they took for God. But your results may vary. Just because these three individuals escaped a burning fiery furnace because God protected them doesn't mean that every time you take a stance for what you believe that God is going to protect you or make everything work out perfect for you, or that you're going to end up like them, being exalted or promoted even higher than you previously were, right? That'd be nice. That'd be a great way to get promoted in our jobs, right? All you got to do is do the right thing. And the next thing you know, your boss is promoting you because you took a stance for your faith. Man, if only it worked that way. Life would be so much easier. But that's not how it works, right? If you look through the New Testament, you're going to know, or you're going to see, that it doesn't always have a happy ending. Individual results may vary. Not everyone in the Bible experienced these results. John the Baptist was beheaded, right? Stephen was stoned. James was killed by King Herod. Paul was put to death by Nero. All of these men who were great men of God, who lived lives that were pointing towards God. They were a spotlight for him. They were examples for us to follow. These men died because of what they believed. So remember, just because you take a stance for God doesn't mean everything is always going to turn out how you want or how you think it should. You're not always going to get that positive result. But God has a plan for you. And his plans are greater than our plans, right? Isaiah says his ways are greater than our ways. His thoughts are higher than our thoughts. He gets to see the overall picture. He gets to see the grand scheme of things. We only get to see this little tunnel, which we call our lives. But we can't see into the future. We don't know what the repercussions of our actions are going to be until we make that decision And then we see what's going to happen, right? But if you don't take a stance for God, I promise you that the results are not going to be positive results. They're not going to be where you want them to be. As I said in the beginning, right, these 3 points kind of come together as not one sentence, but one big idea. And it's this. It's don't follow the crowd. Even if he doesn't save you, even if God doesn't save you, he has a plan for you, right? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego decided that they weren't going to follow the crowd, and it worked out well for them in the end. But don't follow the crowd at the cost of following God. Don't follow the crowd at the cost of compromising your own faith. No job in this world is worth compromising your faith for. No friend is worth compromising your faith for. No relationship is worth compromising your faith for. Nothing in this world is ever worth compromising our faith for. Amen? Nothing in this world is worth it. Because guess what? The things of this world are temporary. They don't last for eternity. The ridicule that you may be put under, the job you may lose, the car you may not be able to buy, the house you may not be able to afford, when we're gone, it's gone. Eventually, all of that's going to be gone in fire anyway when God destroys the earth in the second coming. When you start looking through Revelation and you see how Jesus is going to return, right? And how the end of times are going to happen. And we're going to enter into a time of living for eternity in one of two places, either heaven with God in that place that he's built for us, or hell in eternal damnation and separation from him. What's done for eternity is the only thing that will last. It's the only thing that will matter. Nothing in this world is worth compromising our faith for. It doesn't matter what it is. Even in the extreme case of death, right? Even if that means that you're going to take a stance for your faith, maybe it's as a missionary, maybe it's in another country, maybe it's wherever, you take that stance and you lose your life. Was it worth it? Absolutely. 100% to be able to lose your life for the name of Christ is worth it. You may not think so, but there's two things. A, now you're with God in heaven for eternity, so you got there a little quicker than some of us. You're going to be in a place of joy, so that's a bonus. But you died taking a stance for what you believed in, and that may ring truer and longer than any other thing you do in your life. So even if you lose your life for the name of Christ, remember that God has a plan, and his plan is so much greater than our plan, that we're his instruments on earth for the big picture. I saw this quote on Pinterest the other day, and I thought it was kind of interesting. And it says this: if making you happy costs me my happiness, then I can't afford you. Right? If making you happy costs me my happiness, I can't afford you. I love how that's phrased. If you have to do things for other people that are going to cost you your own emotional happiness or whatever, then you can't afford it. It's not worth it, right? At the end of the day, what do you have to show for it? You're grumpy, you're miserable, you're not happy, and the person is only your friend because you're doing things for them instead of doing things for yourself. If something in this world is going to cost us our morals or what we believe to be true or what we know is true, then guess what? We can't afford it. In the same way that this quote says, I can't afford you if you cost me my happiness, if something is going to cost you to compromise your faith or it's going to cause you to stray away from what you know to be true, then you can't afford it. There will be things in life that seem easy. There'll be things that we think, no doubt, we should be able to do. But when you're in those situations, ask the question, what is this going to cost me? If the cost is a compromise of your faith, then you can't afford it. If we run into situations that ask us to compromise what we believe, then we can't afford it. If that job requires you to compromise your faith, then you don't need that job. You can't afford that job. You may be stressed about making ends meet and you need to do things. God will provide for you. But are you willing to trust in him? The reality is this: not every time we take a stand will it work out the way that we want. Not every time that we go against the crowd will we be elevated higher than where we were. Not every time we stand for what is right will life be easy, right? Throughout history, men and women have been poor, and men and women have struggled, and men and women have lived in poverty for the name of Christ. But they lived a life for Christ, and that's worth so much more for eternity than temporary things here. Don't follow the crowd without first counting the cost. What will happen if you give up or you compromise your faith? You can't get that back once you do that. That reputation, once it's been changed, is so hard to undo. Once you compromise, things are almost over. If the cost of blending in, if the cost of saving your job, if the cost of keeping a friend or a relationship is to compromise your faith or to know what you know is true, then you don't need those things. They're not worth it, and you can't afford them. Because nothing in this life is worth compromising our faith for. As we continue through the book of Daniel, we're going to see another couple instances where Daniel gets put into situations for taking a stance for his faith. And they work out well for him as we continue reading through the Bible. But understand this: as you take those stances for what you believe, as you decide to say, I'm not going to compromise my faith, I'm going to be in this world, but I'm not going to be of it, I'm going to trust God in all things, understand the reality is that things may not always work out. It doesn't mean you did something wrong. It means that God has a different plan for you, and it's an opportunity for you to trust in him. We don't know where God is leading us at all times. Sometimes we have to trust and put our faith in him and take those steps of faith and allow him to walk us through that. But if you don't trust him and you compromise your faith for something you think you need, then you've done more damage than you have good in the long run. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for your word. Lord, we thank you for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, for their story, standing up to the king and refusing to bow down, even that the fear of losing their lives. Lord, they set an example for us that we could only hope to live up to. Lord, I pray as we check ourselves against that mirror, as we check our lives against this passage, Lord, I pray that we would look and see, are there areas where we've compromised our faith for something that we thought we needed rather than trusting in you? Lord, I pray as we move forward throughout the weeks and months and years ahead that we wouldn't compromise our faith. Lord, that we would take a stance no matter how difficult the situation is or no matter what the possible outcome is, even at the cost of losing our life. I pray that we would stand firm for you, knowing that things of this world don't matter, that anything that we gain here has no eternal value. But Lord, taking a stance for you and refusing to walk away from what we believe, that's what matters, and that will last for eternity. So Lord, be with us this week as we face difficult situations, as we possibly face job conflicts that are testing our faith. Lord, I pray that you would give us the courage to do what's right in those moments, not what's easy, but we know is right based on your word. And Father, we pray these things in your Son's name.